Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Donovan Kirkwood. Just a quick background about Doc. After finishing his PhD in plant ecology at UCT in 2002, he started work at Cape Nature as regional ecologist responsible for expert support to protected area management and management plans of regional land use in conservation. By 2008, he was becoming increasingly involved in GIS-based spatial planning to support protected area management, tourism planning, and prioritize focus areas for protected area expansion by stewardship. In 2014, he was appointed to manage the Stellenbosch University Botanical Garden as the curator. Dr. Donovan has worked as a farm manager and freelance photographer before graduating. He's grown plants, he's loved plants all his life. He loves motorbikes, which absolutely excites me because I'm a motorbike lover. All things nature, and today he's going to be talking to us about the role of botanical garden in our unique landscape. He's going to be looking specifically at Stellenbosch as a case study, but he'll be touching on a whole lot more. Now, without any waste of time, Doc, what an absolute pleasure to have you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, John. Just a minor correction. I actually only started at Stellenbosch in 2018, so I'm still a baby there. But the rest was all about right. I just don't want to claim that I've got more history there than I do have. So I want to chat a little bit. I'm going to actually start out this talk picking up where botanical gardens come from, because I think it's actually quite an interesting thing to think about. If you go on the Wikipedia page for what is a botanical garden, you'll notice that it's actually a little bit vague and more than a little conflicted about what it's about. And part of the reason for that is that botanical gardens come from different places. So I want to cover a whole range of stuff from where we come from to where we're going and what we need to do in our current landscape and why. But let's start out with thinking about where we come from. And it's particularly relevant, I think, in a South African context to be serious about thinking about where we come from. Just a note to everyone that you might need to just set your Zoom screen setting sizes so that the PowerPoint shows properly. So you will need to have the video, the proportions of your screen set. And I don't use Zoom often enough to even know how to do that. I'm sorry. Botanical gardens, where do they come from? It's one interesting thing to think about is that they come from different places. So we like to emphasize in modern botanical gardens how important the academic history of botanical gardens is. And in fact, the oldest known botanical garden in the world started as an adjunct to the university. That's the Botanical Garden in Padua in northeastern Italy. And that was a garden that was focused on medicinal plants and medicinal plant use and medicinal plant research. And no doubt many of the botanical gardens in the world have similar origins, including ourselves. But it's also worth remembering that a whole bunch of botanical gardens come from quite a different route. So back in the 1800s and before that, even right through to the 1600s, when the European nations were starting to explore the rest of the world, there were these natural history explorers that went out, and many of them, we probably all have seen the scene of Bates in the left in the Amazon shooting and killing hornbills and bringing them home. But many of the explorers that were going out into these new worlds, into the South American tropics, into the Southeast Asian tropics, and here in the Cape and in South Africa, were in the employ of private collectors who really wanted to have these amazing plants in their own collections. And there was no little amount of terror and curiosity about these amazing, weird and wonderful worlds. This is a sort of typical scene that would have been used to illustrate the dramatic environments that these people were working in. Huge snake in the tree, some terrifying natives surrounding the gentleman, all very scary and exotic. And in the Victorian and era, having these things in private collections was the ultimate interest and status symbol. So rich collectors built these amazing glass houses and housed these incredible curiosities from the rest of the world. So there was this unbelievable focus on really weird and wonderful things, and truly like large and exotic. So in the example on the right, that's Victoria regia, the massive Amazon water lily. And these kind of things would have been kept in private collections. And many botanical gardens came from that background, as well as from a pure research, taxonomy, academic background. And obviously there's overlap between these two things. But for example, our modern gardens still retain a lot of that curiosity, wow, plants in a zoo type factor. So on the right there, we've got an amazing tropical pea that grows in our own tropical house. We've got orchids in the center that come from Southeast Asia, or even in a European context, something like oranges and lemons were something that were difficult to grow and fairly exotic for a long time. And it's worth remembering that even huge institutions like Kew that have an enormous back of house research and conservation focus started largely as private collections that were consolidated and eventually became these public collections. And I feel like it's important to recognize that that curiosity factor, that wow and that exotic factor, still becomes a central theme in deciding what botanical gardens focus on in the current day. But it's worth thinking about the fact that things have moved on a lot. And for example, many of the important botanical gardens in the world, including us, are now members of Botanical Gardens Conservation International, and recognizing that there's a lot going on in a modern world. Here in South Africa, SANBI does unbelievable work that many people aren't really aware of. You know, we see the South African National Botanical Gardens as the kind of public face of SANBI. And yet there's this entire back of house set of research and especially engagement with public conservation policy and evaluation going on in the background. And, you know, things that we take for granted, like the vegetation map of Southern Africa, is a SANBI product and is still driven and managed by SANBI. It's something that constantly needs updating. So what's going on in our modern world? Let's also just have a quick look at where we are right now. So top left there, hopefully everyone can see it, is analysis of the threatened ecosystems, the terrestrial threatened ecosystems of Southern Africa. And you can see that not only in the context of us having 3 major global biodiversity hotspots, but we also have incredible levels of highly threatened landscapes. And those are almost all in the agricultural landscapes of our country. Now, if you look over on that picture on the right there, hopefully you can see my mouse. It's not doing what it should be doing, which is being a proper pointer. Let's make it a laser pointer. There we go. So here we are in the Western Cape. And the Western Cape is very interesting because most of the province is comprised of the Cape floristic region. And this is the richest non-tropical flora in the world. Obviously, there's areas of the Amazon and Southeast Asia that have more plants. But outside of the tropics, we beat everybody else in terms of richness. There was a paper very recently that was published in Nature that looked at global levels of plant threat and highlighted Hawaii as the most threatened plant concentration in the world. And I think the only reason that happened is because they didn't look properly at the South African Red List data. We've got around somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 plants within the Cape Floristic region. And because primarily of the high levels of landscape level ecosystem threat that you can see in that big map, nearly 40% of our flora is in one of the categories of concern for extinction. And the prime driver of this, there are many, many reasons that involve modern human development, but the prime driver in our Cape landscape is certainly just agriculture. If you zoom into this little bit of the Overberg over here, and really this was just a random spot that I picked to take this little screen grab, this is what you see, a patchwork of farms with tiny little slivers of habitat left along drainage lines and so on. Throughout the Overberg, there's probably half a dozen sort of ecologically viable, nice big pieces of Renosterveld habitat. And the exact same situation occurs in the landscape of the Swartlands, the shales of the Swartland. So these big winter wheat growing areas just have incredible levels of habitat threat. And we're seeing similar levels of threat developing in what were less threatened landscapes, especially the Sunveld along the west coast. So in this context, we also need to be aware that the most threatened landscapes are also the least protected ones. The stewardship program, again, led by prioritization from SANBI and many others, is working to rectify the situation. But currently, we're still in a situation where the least threatened habitats are the best protected and the most threatened habitats are the least protected in nature reserves and other formal protected areas. And it's very easy in our modern landscape to point fingers at land invasions and various other things that are happening in the outskirts of our cities and the areas that we see on a daily basis. This is just post the land invasion in Baden-Powell Drive, Strandveld, early over the last 2 years. But let's not forget that the bulk of the landscape transformation has been happening in an agricultural context, probably since the 1800s and certainly accelerating since the early 1900s. So we've got this crazy landscape where we've got plants that occur in really, really small distributions. They might be on one little mountaintop, one little lowland part of the landscape. They're very localized. And when I started my conservation career in 2002, there were many plants that at that time were fairly abundant. So they were listed in one of the categories of concern, red listed in one of the categories of concern, but it didn't seem at that time particularly likely that they were going to be in big trouble. And yet here we are 20 years later, and many of these species have been dramatically reduced in both numbers and extent since that time. So Morea calcicola, for example, from the Saldanha area, is suffering probably ongoing decline in the couple of places where it hangs on. Sotanthus leucanthus is an amaryllis family bulb that was once actually never common. It was always scattered and rare, but was found throughout the kind of lowland sandy areas of the Algolis plain, between Bot River or from Bot River, like through past Hermanus. And, you'd find it fairly regularly in all of those habitats. Well, now it's probably down to, I would imagine, something like a fifth or even a tenth of what that population was only 20 years ago. And you can see that something like that is just an inevitable walk towards extinction. Gladiolus terretifolius, this spectacular red-orange gladiolus from Renosterveld fragments, would have once been probably incredibly common throughout the Overberg. Lots of sites where it would have been sitting in little Renosterveld fragments in amongst a grassy landscape. And now we're down to a handful of populations, and all of those are still probably on ongoing decline and at ongoing risk of actual extinction. Barbiana purpurea for me is a real one that's personal. When I started my career, The area around Bot River still had quite a lot of habitat fragment, the Overberg area. And you would regularly see in those spring years, tens of thousands of Babiana purpurea across big areas. It's now down to less than half a dozen little localities, and those localities have in the dozens of plants. And that is not something that when I was a tender 32-year-old would have even imagined to be possible in such a short space of time. Diza halaki would have once been super abundant along the coastal strip from the peninsula right through to the Eastern Cape. And again, down to a handful of populations, largely just to coastal town development. And I can keep telling these stories for a whole bunch of things, like things that were really relatively abundant only a decade or 2 or 3 ago, already massively impacted by previous landscape change. Let's not underplay that. But now in the last couple of decades, really just taking a beating due to all of these things that are happening in the landscape: coastal development, other development around towns, disturbance, invasives, urban expansion, invasive plants, and ongoing loss of agricultural landscapes. So one of the very interesting things that came out of the 2018 South African National Biodiversity Institute's regional analysis of what was going on in the landscape, the National Biodiversity Assessment, was that we were under the impression previously that these very threatened habitats were at least now fairly secure, in that what was left was unplowable or steep or out of the way and wasn't suffering such rapid ongoing loss. But this analysis very clearly showed that even those habitats are still losing habitat proportionally faster than other habitats. And then another thing that I think from a botanical garden perspective that we need to think about from a conservation perspective, but specifically for botanical gardens, and I'm going to pick on Kirstenbosch here because I happen to find a photo of them, but honestly, this is everywhere and everyone. This is not just Kirstenbosch. The demographics of our country are that we have approximately 9% people of my color, white people. And the bulk of the country is people of color. And yet, if we go into our botanical gardens, and Stellenbosch is one, Kirstenbosch is another, but this is across the board, we're seeing a very heartening trend of increased use by people of color. But the botanical gardens are situated in what were historically white areas. And by far the majority of the user base of these gardens is still people who are white. So that is something that just is something to park and something that has to be addressed across all botanical gardens. We can't do our conservation work if we're only talking to 10% of our South African population. So what is it that modern botanical gardens do? You saw the historical stuff. It was kind of very curiosity based, and there was a research component. But now we're working in a landscape where South Africa is not unique in having threatened habitats, even though we do have a whole lot more and more richness than elsewhere. But modern botanical gardens are trying to address a lot of this stuff. So they're doing a whole range of things, and the range of things that they do depends on what the botanical garden's particular interest and focus is. So it could be anything from this suite of stuff that's up on my screen. It's interesting to me, I've had the opportunity to go to a few European botanical gardens and look at, obviously with a very keen eye, what people are up to. And for example, in a European context, so let's pick on maybe a fairly boring, I don't want to offend anybody, but let's take a nameless Middle European botanical garden. They will often have just a purely general environmental education focus. So here's the stuff that's going on in the world. let's teach you a little bit about sustainability, and they might talk about green roofs, they might talk about water use, they might talk about things like that, but they very seldom make specific calls to specific habitats or anything like that. Some botanical gardens, especially in England, have an incredibly strong horticulture focus that comes from their history. So they're interested in breeding and plant development and plants for your garden and telling you stories about those. A huge number of botanical gardens these days have very strong conservation programs, and those conservation programs tend to talk to their landscape or what they're up to. So, for example, Kew holds the Millennium Seed Bank that's got a global focus. They've got a huge living collection that is conservation work. They do conservation research. They hold a huge number of ex situ plants. Many botanical gardens, especially in the States, but all over the place, are actively doing habitat restoration. So they'll bulk up, they'll grow plants and they'll bulk them and they'll put them out for restoring degraded habitats in the landscape, often with a specific focus on particularly threatened species. And then, of course, many botanical gardens have also or either a research focus. But these things are often tightly linked. So if we think of, for example, something like Missouri Botanical Gardens, they've got a massive research focus, strong taxonomic programs. They're effectively a plant university. We're a little baby garden. What's our deal in this world of stuff? So I think for us, we look around at what's going on in the landscape, what we need to do, and we think about what other gardens are doing, our personal history of context, the value of plants and nature in our landscape, and that leads to thinking about what we need to do. So what is it that Stellenbosch needs to do? Also, we're thinking about is where we come from. Sorry, I should keep an eye of time because I've got a lot of slides. We started very early. The botanical garden comes from originally a small teaching garden that was grown next to the botany department in 1902. But by 1921, they'd already outgrown that and allocated a specific property for the botanical garden. And that happened in 1922, that it was really established properly. Now, that makes us, as far as I'm aware, the oldest university botanical garden in South Africa. And it's worth just being clear that we are not part of SANBI and the SANBI Botanical Gardens. We are an independent entity that sits under Stellenbosch University. And the early days at Stellenbosch were remarkably productive. And as you'll note, excessively white and male. Poor old Vera Duffy very rapidly got replaced by a slew of middle-aged white males that have continued unabated until myself, unfortunately. But Mr. Hans Herre, who was the first curator of Stellenbosch, was a remarkable field botanist and research botanist. And this is reflected, the teaching background, the academic background of the university is reflected in how it was laid out and conceived from the very start. So you can see if you look at this, that there's very clear sections and labels for the garden. This is actually looking straight onto Harmonie residence. So if you come in our Netlink Street entrance and you look over, the building behind hasn't changed at all in the last nearly 100 years. And if you look at what's going on the map for this garden, dating from 1948, that hasn't changed much from the beginning of the garden, you'll see that it's very clearly laid out both to cover specific habitats of South Africa and plant systematics for teaching, which is a wonderful and great way to arrange a botanical garden. And old Hans Herre was an amazing field botanist with a particular interest in mesems and succulents. And I think he's got something like 20 odd species either named after him or that he himself described. more than that, in fact, and some of these are still in our collections. Just harking back to the demographics of our country, one of the unfortunate things, of course, was that every botanical garden, including ours, was by white people for white people. Post-Hera, there was probably a fairly significant period where the garden took on a much more horticultural park focus. So although plants were still labeled, which is one of the key characteristics of a botanical garden, there was a strong interest in aesthetics, and perhaps some of that curiosity, exoticness, amazing plant focus that we saw from the Victorian era. Excuse me. We have a number of plants that are in our collection still that were brought in this era because of their hey wow exotic factor, even if they weren't from our own landscape. But what is it that we should be doing now? Well, you saw our South African context. We've got a bunch of threatened habitats. We've got literally thousands of extremely threatened plant species that are in desperate need of assistance. We need to do environmental education around that. We need to teach people about sustainability. There's horticulture, of course, that people are interested in. And we as an academic garden still need to maintain a role as a teaching and research support garden. And that's an insane amount of things to do. So we've got this grandiose vision that goes with that, that we're going to use our unique context and flexibility to do incredible things for South African plant conservation and education. We've got a mission that speaks to that. But I think we have to be very realistic about what we can achieve and what any agency can achieve, actually. There's probably around 3,000 plant species that are considered threatened in the Cape Flora. And if you take South Africa as a whole, obviously many, many more. And an alarming proportion of these are actually at nearly immediate extinction risk in the wild. There's a very good chance they will go extinct in the wild within decades. So I think one of the key things I want to just stress here is that we're not trying to be heroes in South Africa and do amazing things that no one else is doing. We need to all work together. And I think it's one of the wonderful things about the plant community is that SANBI is not our competitor. They're a partner. None of the other botanical gardens are our competitors. There's more work than any of us can manage together. And we do need to work together and work smartly. So just to emphasize that, we're a tiny garden. We're 7 permanent staff. Currently 2 are vacant, and we haven't filled those because of COVID and the situation with space and not being in a room together, of only 1.7 hectares. So that's 17,000 square meters. It's very small. But we have these incredible botany and other departments that are close collaborators of ours in the university, which is wonderful. We've got an amazing established reputation as a wonderful visitor attraction. Pre-COVID, we were seeing something like 130,000 visitors a year, of which about half were staff and students. We're situated within the winelands, which is the most threatened part of the threatened Cape Lowlands landscape. And I think one thing that's very important for us at Stellenbosch University is that the landowners of the region probably send their students more to Stellenbosch University than to other universities. So I'm hoping that we've also got more of an opportunity than elsewhere to brainwash the landowners of our landscape. So a couple of slides ago, I was showing you all the things we need to be doing. And as I said, that's a crazy amount of stuff. And to try and achieve it with a small staff, with a small budget, is incredibly hard. So how do we actually go about doing that strategically? Well, my personal take is that we try and double dip on everything where we can. So wherever possible, we do stuff that we do so that it achieves multiple outcomes in the same project. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you some very practical examples. We are extremely fortunate to have been supported by funding from Table Mountain Fund, which is within WWF. The intention with a project that we're undertaking, we're starting construction this year and we aim to be finished by the end of 2023 with all the signage and so on. We should actually be planted by the end of this year, hopefully, at least the initial stuff. And the aim here is to showcase for the first time representative habitat of a bunch of threatened lowlands. People can't get easily into these landscapes. They're often private land, they're remote, they're far from roads. And we believe that in order to win hearts and minds, you do absolutely have to get people to make a personal connection with these things. So that's part of what we're trying to do here. But you'll also notice that each of those beds is clad with stone that represents the geology of the habitats they come from. So there's an opportunity for us, for example, to work with earth sciences and use it as a geology teaching tool, supporting our teaching function. Each of these habitats also will be carefully selected so that they can provide key areas to grow active populations of some of the most threatened species from these habitats. So one nice example that we've done very well with is Algolis Fragilis. It was thought extinct since 1936 until Rupert, who's in that picture, Rupert Koopman, who's currently the conservation manager for Botanical Society. He rediscovered it. He wouldn't have been sure what it was if he hadn't worked with our Botanical Gardens taxonomic expertise at the botany department, Prof. Leon Dreyer and Dr. Kenneth Oberlander. And they were able to confirm now that we have the species. It is that thought to be extinct species. We still only know it from the one site. And we've done, if I may say so myself, amazingly well at propagating the species from seed. It's a recalcitrant seeded species, so it cannot be seed banked. The seeds must grow. They can't be dried. And we've gone from our original conservation collection of about 50 plant cutting or divisions of about 50 plants. And we're now up to something like 3,000 plants after only 2 years of propagation. And we aim to do the same sort of thing in all the other habitats. So we want to represent a winelands alluvial habitat. And a key flagship there would be the Humanthus Pamelia on the left, which again was, in the thousands of plants 20 years ago and is probably down to hundreds of plants currently. Swellendam Renosterveld offers an amazing opportunity to showcase some very pretty Renosterveld and do a species like this. This is Pelargonium fergusoni, which is endangered and still losing habitat in the landscape and probably only at a half dozen sites. So we do this within the scope of our BGCI accreditation. We want to support and work within the sensible policy and implementation framework that has been put together by a bunch of partners led by SANBI. And we certainly do this within South Africa's plant strategy for conservation that was led by SANBI. So just to kind of quickly flip through these slides, the key things is that we're thinking about indigenous knowledge, teaching about important plant areas. Forgive my dog scratching at the window. We're thinking about ecosystem conservation and teaching people about it. We're teaching, and we want to do also capacity development. So we have a big set of interns as well. But for us, I think probably because of our small size, one of the best things we can do is do ex situ plant conservation and get things out to other institutions. I think, when I started my career, habitat conservation was really considered the only viable way to do conservation. We're now realizing we're at the point where if we don't have ex situ populations of many species, there's a very good chance they'll go completely extinct. And we need to do something about that. And I think it's very important, again, to emphasize we don't want to do this alone, and we don't want to do this in isolation, and we don't want to do this without partnering across multiple institutions, including SANBI. we all need to spread the risk, because no single institutional place is entirely safe or good to keep everything in perpetuity. For us, because we're tiny, bulbs are a great target group, and you can grow literally thousands of them within 1 square meter. So I think a key thing with conservation growing is the numbers of plants you have really matter. You can't repopulate a landscape from 1 or 2 clonal individuals. That is not a genetically viable basis to restore a species or restore something into a habitat. So we aim for collections that are at least 50 individuals, and preferably hundreds to thousands. Bulbs allow us to do that in a very small space, and I'm not also going to lie, they're relatively easy for a less experienced staff to grow than, for example, ericas that tend to be very fussy, or proteas that take up a whole bunch of space. Of course, we need to do outreach and teaching, and that's a very important part of our display beds. And we want people to engage with plants in any way we can. So, for example, we might teach about medicinal plants. We might teach about the flavors of fynbos. We might talk about the plants that drove the evolution of humankind, probably here in the Strandveld landscapes of the Western Cape, eating things like Morea fugax bulbs that you can see the yellow flower third from left there. So there's an enormous amount to do. And I think, just to emphasize again, that the only way that we're going to do it is to link to habitats, try and do some ex situ conservation, support research in the departments and conservation, but as far as possible, make sure that when we're doing these things, that we overlap each as much as possible, so that we can achieve multiple outcomes from any one project that we do. But I'm going to leave you, I'm going to wrap up and leave you with what I feel to be probably still the most intractable question for our botanical garden and for our strategy going forward. Is it's all very well to get people through our garden. And for example, SANBI has made amazing products. They've led the coordination of landscape level conservation plans, the critical biodiversity area maps that provide quite specific guidance to land use decision making and development on what is appropriate where, what kind of habitats should be developed, can still be developed, how assessment needs to be done, all of these kinds of things. But that is a product for a specific context. Botanical gardens are getting general visitors from all over the world, from all over South Africa, from many different walks of life in South Africa, from learners at schools that don't have huge budgets and are from a primarily PDI background, through to wealthy white kids with cars bought by mommy. You know, you name it, we've got all sorts. So in the face of that broad spectrum of visitors coming into our garden, what should, as botanical gardens, our call to action be to those visitors? What is it that we want them to do in the landscape to support all of our strategic priorities? I don't have a clear answer for that question. I'm hoping that there's a way for John to screen cap some of the cool answers and questions, but I would love to hear from the participants, the audience, what they think you as a general member of the public can do to support strategic conservation at a landscape level. What is it that we should be asking our visitors at a botanical garden to do? And I think that's a very important thing. It's not enough anymore that you come merely to be entertained. We want to brainwash you and have you leave thinking, what is it that I can do to make a difference? So on that note, I will leave you with a fairly unresolved answer. But please know that we are doing an enormous amount to get you excited about plants, and specifically to focus on making sure that some of our most threatened plants don't go extinct. Thank you so much. John, if you could come back and manage the questions, I would appreciate it. There you are. Lovely to see your face again.
Wow, what a thought-provoking presentation, and absolutely amazing. And I think what you've done is you've literally opened our minds, and you've really started making all of us think, you know, outside the box of how do we bring everybody together. I think one of the key things that you mentioned, I think throughout your presentation, was literally working together we can achieve more. You spoke quite at length about collaborations, biodiversity access. You know, how do we bring everybody together, multiple stakeholders from various racial groups. You've spoken extensively about outreach and teaching. And I think what's interesting to me in particular is I'm predominantly in the marketing and events space at SANBI at Stellenbosch, and one of our primary projects that we work on, which a lot of our participants here are aware of, is the Summer Sunset Concerts. And while is a very huge entertainment project, you know, trying to get artists in, but we've always tried to see how best we can bring certain campaigns into the mix, so that we can start slowly educating the public about certain things that we'd like to, you know, to achieve. We've ran things like bin-free campaign, and you know, it's been going extensively. But what we do in terms of our marketing outreach would then, obviously through our concerts, you know, attract certain artists that would predominantly be for a certain a demographic, you know, bring them in. But then through that, you know, once we pull everybody in, then we're able to start translating some of this messaging and punting it quite a little bit, you know. And we've seen, you know, a slight change, you know, even in behavior of visitors, where you're saying no bin campaign means whatever you bring into the garden, in your picnic basket, make sure that you take all of those things, put them back in your plastic, in your picnic basket, take it back home and dispose of it properly, you know? Yes. So it's very interesting, you know, your input and your presentation, and really trying to get us to think differently. So yeah, that's just 2 cents from my side. But I want to take this opportunity to welcome a whole lot more. I think we've got a lot more questions that we've got for you, Doc. So let me start by doing this. And I've been trying to chat to the team while we still had the presentation going. And I wanted to see if we can try something different. Sherry Croden. We have unmuted you and we have given you space to be able to ask your questions. So we're gonna just try 2-3 questions today from our visitors today that are part of the call, and see how it goes. So let's start with Sherry. Sherry, are you on the call with us this morning?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Oh,
we can hear you perfectly.
Good morning. Good morning, my opportunity. Thank you very much, Dr. Kirkwood, for your extremely interesting talk about Stellenbosch University Botanical Garden, of which I'm a frequent visitor, but maybe had visited the garden as in the traditional demographics, and had perceived the collections in more superficially. That I was very impressed with the depth in which you took us through today on your talk. And my question was actually, when you know, we were frequent visitors, we were always popping in, and it was very uncomplicated. And then they introduced, and I think it was originally for security purposes, the membership system. I have no problem with that. It's a very small fee, and it seems to work, but I'm just interested to know, how has this been seen? Has it been a success? Does it encourage, you know, students, for example, in Stellenbosch University, people who were not in the typical demographic range, or has it put them off from entering the garden? Thank you.
It's very hard to assess that question in the current COVID situation. We're down to about 30% of pre-COVID visitor numbers. But my sense is that it hasn't been a problem. Firstly, the amount is relatively low, even compared to the cost of transport to get to the garden, relatively. The entry fee, our fees, by the way, are 15 Rand single entry, 10 Rand for seniors. But we also do provide completely free entry for any pre-arranged educational visits. And all Stellenbosch students and staff get free entry on their staff cards or student cards. And I think we've seen a gradual, steady increase in mixed demographics coming into the garden. It's still, more, the proportions still are far from being representative of the garden as a whole. I mean, as the country as a whole, but it's definitely improving. And I think it's worth also considering that one should think about the fact that our entire botanical heritage is also incredibly Eurocentric. And, here it's very hard for me to know because I come from that history, but I can imagine that it's not just an entrance fee that's an issue. It's the fact that we use botanical Latin that is essentially Eurocentric. That our common names are almost always primarily recorded as English or Afrikaans common names rather than in any one of the other many official languages. There's a lot of work to do to make it a more welcoming space and more inclusive. And that obviously starts with getting staff that are inclusive, that can lead this work.
Awesome, Doc. I think, we keep trying some of the few things, and we thought since we have a little bit of time, we could take just a few questions directly from the call. But let me also take just a few comments that are coming in from our chat box, and I'm encouraging everybody to just post their comments. Judy Dixon says, approaching botanical passionate people in various different areas to possibly reintroduce certain species in their own environment. And she's primarily talking about active citizen scientists, which is some of the answering the question that you posed at the end over there. Susan saying an idea
sorry,
of
John,
a take home.
Sorry. So just
go for it.
Yes, thank you for highlighting that. I think iNaturalist and other citizen science platforms are an unbelievable opportunity to engage a broad spectrum of the public. And I think one thing that's often very underappreciated about the value of a platform like that is that for me to try and explain to you just how much plant diversity there is out there and how localized it is and what the patterns of distribution are is a very hard thing to convey in a presentation or a conversation or a teaching engagement. But if you engage on iNaturalist regularly and you try and identify plants and then you start ranging further afield, it's an incredibly good organic way of suddenly realizing, oh my gosh, there's 50 Trachyandras and 13 of them are super localized. I'm making these numbers up, but you start to get a handle on the nature and the grain of the diversity in our landscape. And I think, these modern tools are, I didn't actually really appreciate until recently just how incredible they are for engagement.
Most certainly. Let me just take a couple more. Susan saying an idea, obviously, thought-provoking inputs that you've given to all our visitors on the call. An idea of a take-home for visitors, especially South African visitors. Start a garden, make changes to one's garden so that the plants in the garden are indeed local. Thinking of fynbos life, map of general habitat types, maybe so people can relate to their areas and apply simple changes, and provide plant or place names, nurseries, where one can find relevant plants of that nature. Sorry, that little input just suddenly disappeared from my screen here. One potential answer to your question, positive peer pressure. When garden visitors are sufficiently informed, they need to be communicating with people they know that own or manage threatened habitats or species in a way which ensures future survival and is good for people and the planet. A question from Sally. What are the implications for plant-specific insect in the decline in these plants, for instance? And she gives examples of some butterflies rely on specific plants as food for their caterpillars.
Yes, that's a very complicated question. What we know is that insect diversity is as or more phenomenal in the Cape Floristic region than the plant diversity, and it's very poorly correlated with our habitat units that we describe. So the botany is probably under-resourced in this country, but insect research is even more under-researched, under-resourced. But for example, and I'll pick up also a little bit on the previous question, I'm a bit of a heretic. I do not believe in indigenous planting. I think unless you're doing actual restoration from local plants, which is what one should be doing to support local habitat, that general South African indigenousness, even if it's Cape indigenous, doesn't provide significantly more biodiversity benefits in a garden than any other plants. And there's a range of water-wise exotic plants also available. But what we do know, to pick up on the insect thing, is that when you start planting with really local plants, things that would occur within, say, a 5 or 6 kilometer radius of your site, that there's some early evidence that it really does support incredible insect diversity. Because so many of these plants, it's not just about specific pollinator interactions and things like that. Those interactions are relatively rare. But what is very common is that plants are quite specific to foods in terms of plant hosts and things like that. And there's even been indications from an American study that birds are not more abundant in locally planted gardens, but they fledge more young. So they don't breed more often, they don't make more eggs, but they have a higher successful fledge rate when you plant with local plants, because there is the natural insect diversity for them to select from and feed their offspring with. So there's some intriguing early indications that's important. And I think one needs to be, again, very aware of context. So locally indigenous planting might be super important within a 1 kilometer radius of Table Mountain National Park or another national park, for example, but far less important if you're kilometers from anywhere in the middle of suburbia, in which case anything that supports bees, birds, and butterflies is wonderful.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. Let me take two questions, which are quite similar. One is from Rupert and the other one from Nathan. And the one from Rupert is actually a question back to you in terms of what can be done. Oh, sorry, am I mixing questions now? What can be done? Oh, I think it's Nicola. Sorry, I apologize for that. Nicola is asking what can be done to include more people of color to be able to access these botanical gardens and raise awareness to threatened species. And I think you've touched a little bit on that. And then Nathan says, surely being a botanical garden at a university, especially University of Stellenbosch, should provide a golden opportunity to influence young minds What programs have you introduced to stimulate such interest? And he's also mentioning that he's a proud ex-Mati student as well. So yeah, over to you, Doc.
I have the attention span of a gnat. Could you just quickly paraphrase the first question?
So the first question is mainly, what can be done to increase people of color, just to attract more of them into botanical gardens, and also what kind of programs you've got, at the university to just attract these young minds from different.
So again, COVID is somewhat of a disaster. Everyone's shut down everything, but part of it is one of the nice things is there's this modern, better understanding of nature connectedness. There's actually a research program on this in the UK. And we're starting to have a better grasp of how to get people to really be connected to nature. And prettiness or beauty matters. Being in a beautiful environment, being surrounded by wonderful things, feeling positive connection to stuff is definitely critical. So for example, the new lowland beds that we're doing, being incredibly careful about the design values and the rock cladding, and information as design is a key element of that, and something that hopefully can attract or appeal to a broad spectrum of people. But I think part of it is just the good old traditional stuff that, for example, SANBI already does with your bus program, where you have transport available to bring students and schools into Stellenbosch. We have a much smaller resource base and budget. We don't have a dedicated vehicle, but that's definitely something that we would like to do more. If anyone listening has money they don't know what to do with, burning a hole in their pocket, we have a donation fund that you're more than welcome to contribute. And you could, for example, specify that you would like to bring school kids to the garden and cover transport for a bus for 1 or 2 or 10 days. So that's definitely something you can do. And then I think the other thing that is very important is to also support suitable developments in areas that are close to people of color. Let's not also just talk about busing people of color into botanical gardens that are far from them. I do think we need to be thinking about establishing botanical gardens in population centers that are more evenly distributed. So one example, it's not a botanical garden, but it's a wonderful, wonderful initiative, is there's a thing called Friends of Princess Flay that is working very hard to do habitat restoration on the outskirts of Princess Flay in an area that is an important heritage feature of that community. And these are the kind of things that we should be showcasing and supporting and talking about and getting people involved in and making sure that they succeed. So I think sort of three-pronged, basically. Ship more people to us, create display values that appeal to everyone and are welcoming, but also get people involved close to where they live.
Awesome.
Sorry. So then you're going to have to now remind me of the second question, which I also cannot remember.
All right. I think park the second question for just 2 seconds, because I think you've touched quite a bit on that. It was more to do with the type of program that you have at the university, just to attract the students that are currently already on campus, capitalizing on that base that you've got. But before you do that, I think we've just gone a little bit over time, but I think, we still have so many participants on the call. So I'm going to do just one more thing quickly. Renee, I'm going to take one more question, since this was a hand that was raised very earlier on in your presentation. I'm going to take Renee quickly. Renee, are you on the call? You can unmute your mic and you can ask your question in literally 5 seconds. Go for it, Renee.
She's still muted.
I think she's still muted. All right, we'll just leave Renee for now. I think maybe I'll just take one more question from the floor, because we've got lots of them. And what we'll do Doc will just consolidate some of all the, questions and feedback that you've just received on the call, and then we'll just package it and then email it to you just so that you can see. And when you have time, please respond, and then we'll post it on our Facebook page. So please go on and like our Facebook page, Stellenbosch National Botanical Facebook page, as well as Straight Nature Facebook page. The presentation live recording will be there, as well as some of the comments and questions that have been posted today. Now, the last one says, David, in support of the visibility assistance issue, I grew up in Somerset West. Let me do this quickly. I grew up in Somerset West and spent much time in Stellenbosch, but myself and my family only heard about Stellenbosch Botanical Garden through friends around 6 years ago. So please find ways to make yourselves better known to the general public. And this in turn should yield long-term benefits. So we're putting this to you that we need to promote that botanical garden, because some of the pictures that you showed were absolutely spectacular. So let me do this, Doc. Let me give you just 30 seconds closing remarks, and then let's wrap up the show and thank one another. Over to you, Doc.
Thanks so much. I think the answer to a few of those questions is, for example, working very hard on new displays that speak to all of these elements that are important. And we're really hoping that you're in fact the first audience who's finding out about our new lowland displays. We did not want to showcase them until we were really sure that we were on the verge of development. But these kind of things basically doing a good job gets eyes, and we hope that will really work. But hey, if anyone is an advertising exec or a promotions person, John, you want to come and sit on our advisory committee, we certainly would welcome more exposure. But that is why we're here, so that you can find out about us.
Awesome. Doc, I think, I think you speak so beautifully, and you presented so well that, we literally have so many people still logged on the call. And I think it's just in the manner in which you've approached the presentation, just completely opened our interest, our love. You've mixed how we should leverage from one another, incorporate, just working together, achieving more things, and just the broader growth of biodiversity and protection of plant species. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And I think what you've literally set the tone for us to just continue this engagement a little bit more. And what I'm hoping to see from everybody that's still on the call now is that we'll be able to consolidate, take some of these comments, post them on social media, and just continue these conversations. Let's carry these conversations on, because I think the more we talk about these things, we'll be able to reach more people and actually start influencing a lot more people a bit more. And in terms of leveraging, let's see how we can leverage. Let's share some of the stuff. I'm going to literally go and look at your Stellenbosch National Botanical Garden Facebook page, and I hope you have one. I'm going to like that page, and I'm going to start sharing some of the content that you guys have so that we can increase that leveraging opportunity.
Thank you. We also have an active Instagram page, which shares the same content as the Facebook page. So I find it less cluttered and generally more popular, but the handle for both of them is the same. We're SU BOT Garden. No spaces, no underscores, no nothing on both of those.
Awesome. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Another fantastic presentation by yours truly. Thank you so much. I think what we should be doing right now is, as soon as things have, settled down a little bit, we'll be making our way to come and visit your botanical garden out there in Stellenbosch, and definitely enjoying in the beautiful space that you've just shared with us today. From myself and the whole team, thank you once again to all the team that's making all of this happen in the background, Belinda and the team at Straight Nature, Kathy Ebert, we absolutely love you. So And to the rest of everybody that's still on the call, thank you so much for joining us. Without you and your presence, all these talks would not be possible. Thank you for joining us from all over the world. And remember to keep safe. Let's maintain social distancing. Remember to sanitize and let's wear a mask. And if possible, let's all try and get vaccinated so that we can get that herd immunity so we can go out and enjoy all these beautiful spaces that have been shared with us. That's all from today, and thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you guys in the next Wednesday talk. Doc, thank you so much. It's been a blessing to have you on the show. And yeah, we look forward to having more of this engagement with you in the near future. So thank you, everybody. Take care, be safe, and have a fantastic day. Cheers, everybody. Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
You too.